Hello and welcome to the second session of the Times newspaper in this scheme of work. This session is on industry, and I guess a little word of warning about this session is that it is quite long compared to the other two on media language representation and the last one on audiences. And the reason this is so long is that there's a few videos embedded into this PowerPoint to watch. There is a documentary for you to watch alongside this as well, and there's research tasks for you to complete along the way, just so you get a better understanding of the issues discussed. And that's because the history and the industry and the context surrounding newspapers is really broad, it's really interesting, it has a long history, it's constantly changing, and of course we will only scratch the surface on many of the issues, but the ones that we're discussing are relevant to our set texts. So hopefully you'll learn a lot of new things by watching this video, and more than that, it will allow you to engage and have an opinion on some really significant debates surrounding the industry of newspapers. So if anything, what we'd like you to get from this is to really discuss a variety of issues that are raised by the idea of ownership of contemporary newspapers. And of course, from our perspective of bringing this or taking this new knowledge into the exam, you should be able to apply the theoretical framework and understand these institutional and economic factors, stuff which you've probably never really thought about in great detail before, but that's all part of it. And so the first question really dives in at the deep end here and looks at this idea of how significant is the proprietor of a newspaper, and the proprietor is the owner of a newspaper. So just think about this and scribble down some ideas. I would do this immediately. To think about what the significance is of the ownership of a newspaper, maybe by one person. Now that we're thinking of the Times specifically, we're going to focus on, of course, Rupert Murdoch. I've got two videos here that I want you to watch about the rise and so-called fall of Rupert Murdoch, and then I'd like you to conduct your own research. Think about the history. What is the history of his organisations and businesses, and what is his agenda ideologically? What is his agenda? How has the ideology of the owner and the company had an effect on the media products? And you can look into some of the ways that's manifested itself. Then to consider the two biggest newspapers that Rupert Murdoch owns are obviously the Times and the Sun, one of which, the Times, is a broadsheet that's famous across the world and has been for many years, and the Sun is the biggest selling newspaper in the UK. Which one would you say has more autonomy? Does the Times have more control over its output compared to the Sun? And what are the issues that are brought up for this most significant for you? And once you've done this research and once these videos are made some notes, you can think, what aspects of the theoretical framework can we actually apply here? So watch the videos, after that do some research, and then have a think and see if you can answer some of those questions.
Do you like the feeling of power you have as a newspaper proprietor, of being able to sort of formulate policies for a large number of newspapers in every state of Australia?
Well, there's only one honest answer to that, of course, and that's yes.
In 1968, Rupert Murdoch arrived in London to negotiate the purchase of the News of the World, seeing off his only real rival, Robert Maxwell, and within a year he'd acquired and shortly after relaunched The Sun. Murdoch was here to stay, and he was determined to alter the character of British journalism. Few would doubt that Murdoch is a newspaper man. It's in his blood. His father, Keith Murdoch, was a war correspondent, and following his death in 1952, the 21-year-old Rupert left his sub-editor's job at the Daily Express in London to run the family business back in Australia. So began a pattern for Murdoch's career: hostile takeovers, rapid expansion, bold risk-taking, and a hands-on approach to running his business.
You don't delegate very well, I'm told. You take decisions at a very minor level, deciding what program should go on a television service, this sort of stuff.
I delegate enormously. I have to. There aren't enough hours in the day to run everything. I delegate everything. But when I'm around, I interfere a bit too much.
It didn't take Murdoch long to make himself an enemy of the British establishment, printing gossipy stories, and notoriously digging up 10-year-old dirt with the publication of Christine Keeler's diaries in 1972. But circulation figures of both his UK titles were promising, and the very nature of the popular press seemed to be evolving under his direction.
Let's see what's happening in the Star this week. First, Glenn and Sarah Campbell talk about his unreleased record, Sarah's Song, and the Star prints all its lyrics for you. Then the latest on Kojak, King Kong's girlfriend, Clark Gable's son, and Rosalind Carter's second-hand inaugural gown.
In 1973, Murdoch left Britain, turning his attention to the United States. He soon founded the supermarket tabloid The Star and later purchased the New York Post. But at the start of the 1980s, perhaps sensing a natural political ally in the newly elected Margaret Thatcher, Murdoch returned to Britain to launch a bid for the ailing Times and Sunday Times.
I don't believe that the people who read the Times are any better than the people who read the Sun. I just believe they're different.
But
I'm very proud of the Sun.
On the face of it, this is the establishment's worst nightmare. One of the pillars of British conservatism, run by a man known only for his populist approach. But the alternative was the very real prospect of the Times and Sunday Times falling out of business completely.
Obviously, you will wonder what my plans are for the papers. Whatever proposals for progress may be developed, there will be no fundamental change in the characteristics. I am not seeking to acquire these papers in order to change them into something entirely different.
Having successfully altered the character of the popular press in Britain, Murdoch set his sights on the industry itself, instigating an audacious shift from his printing plant in Fleet Street to a state-of-the-art facility in Wapping in East London. The new plant was built and developed under a shroud of secrecy and fired into operation when a Fleet Street strike was called in January 1986. Redundancy notices on the printers were served and the so-called Battle of Wapping began.
The Wapping dispute has produced some of the worst scenes of violence since the miners' strike. Hundreds of demonstrators and policemen have been injured as, each Saturday, the streets around the plant are turned into a battleground.
This is industrial relations, Rupert Murdoch style, but it has great implications for all groups of workers.
You're looking for Rupert Murdoch, we know where he is. He's hiding behind the old barbed wire. How'd you know?
The strike lasted a year, and the fallout broke the back of the Fleet Street trade unions, who were forced to fall into line with Murdoch's working practices and relocate. But by this time, Murdoch had already moved on, setting his sights firmly on the advent of satellite television.
5, 4,
3, 2, 1.
Run BTC.
By the end of the 1980s, Murdoch had the bit between his teeth. He purchased 20th Century Fox in America in 1984 and launched the Fox Broadcasting Company the following year. His plans for satellite broadcasting in Britain, meanwhile, had the media establishment reeling.
What I get quite angry about with him and his newspapers is the way they continually knock what has gone before, and there was more of that today. He dismissed drama and sport and comedy. I mean, he's probably never seen Bread or Any Fools and Horses.
If the hemorrhage of cash can't be staunched, you set a time limit on how long you take the losses, say 5 years.
Oh, of course. Whether it be 5 years or 4 years or 6 years, that wouldn't depend on his extent.
Sky's losses nearly bankrupted him, and he was forced to merge with British Satellite Broadcasting to form B-Sky B. B-Sky B then staked everything on the newly formed Football Premier League. This bold and ultimately successful move coincided with a shift in thinking in the Labour Party, who were about to concede a good deal of ground to make themselves electable. Old Labour became New Labour. Tony Blair paid court to Rupert Murdoch, and for the first time in decades, Murdoch titles began giving their backing to the Labour Party.
Mr. Murdoch, how would you describe your relationship with Tony Blair?
I'm a supporter.
Rupert Murdoch has always maintained he does not subscribe to one political ideology, but his free market, anti-union, anti-establishment and pro-consumer choice stance places him firmly in the party of individual interest. He's cunning, ruthless, single-minded, perhaps even brilliant, but he's also ageing. As the 90s became the noughties, Murdoch finally began to open the door to his potential successors. First his eldest son Lachlan, then younger son James.
You're familiar with the word mafia?
Yes, Mr. Watson?
Mr. Murdoch, you must be the first mafia boss in history who didn't know he was running a criminal enterprise.
Mr. Watson, please. I think that's inappropriate. Mr. Chairman.
We just finished our meal and we're just going home, so...
So what have we seen with the revelations of phone hacking? An organisation with a swollen sense of power and entitlement that has allowed itself to disregard any sense of moral responsibility. The anti-establishment establishment thinks it can do what it wants. Or just an overpowerful company left to graze by its ageing monarch overreaching and let down by successors charged with its care. The Leveson Inquiry and the scandal of phone hacking will rumble on, as will News Corporation. The question on Wednesday is whether this is the moment that Rupert Murdoch finds a way to start a fight back.
As for my comments, Mr. Chairman, and my statement, which I believe was around the closure of the News of the World newspaper.
Before you get to that, I would just like to say one sentence. This is the most humble day of my life.
Rupert Murdoch is a man regarded by many as having the golden touch.
From the beginning, Rupert Murdoch has been up to his elbows in printing ink and politics.
I think his real taste is for power, and I think it's both political power and, if you like, social power.
I don't think I'm ruthless at all. I think that's entirely something that's painted by people like yourselves and so on, because they feel that people who run newspapers are somehow remote, somehow very interesting, and they must be sort of great ogres of some sort or other.
The press rolls on, and our newest daily is printed.
Rupert's always had this affinity with the news, and this is something that he learned at his father's feet. It's something that has been within him from the day that he had his first rational thought.
Hello, how are you?
Some people want to turn him into a complete demon with horns. I've never quite seen him as that. I think he loves newspapers. He's done a great job of sustaining and employing journalists. But there's another side to him which is ruthless and almost predatory.
The dawn of television's new age.
I don't know what you mean by down market and up market. That is so English, class-ridden snobbery when you talk like that. We broadcast for everybody.
There is a lot of media and choice and creative opportunities that have existed because of the path he has chosen and taken a lot of risk to do it, a lot of personal risk.
Rupert Murdoch's career as a media owner began in Adelaide in 1952. He now sells newspapers in every state, claiming nearly 1 in 2 Australian adults as readers each week. He's a TV owner too. In the UK, he began with tabloid publications, eventually adding the respectable Times. He catapulted Sky TV into a massive business in Europe, following it up with Star TV in Asia. In America, he also started with tabloids, later securing his jewel, the Wall Street Journal. Along the way, he built a multimedia cash cow, 21st Century Fox, with TV and movies. 50,000 people call him their boss, and his media has a potential reach of more than half the world's population. Rupert Murdoch has reportedly met every US president since Truman, as well as countless English and Australian prime ministers.
Politicians still dance to his attendance, and so that's encouraged him, I think, to behave with a kind of impunity.
What he's achieved is absolutely extraordinary.
Mark Day began as a copy boy for Rupert Murdoch's News newspaper in 1960.
I've been on the stone, the old composing room floor with Rupert with shirts rolled up, pushing the last form away on a new title.
He's tired of the claim that Murdoch tells his editors what to write.
I think he's given more influence than he actually has, but it is fair to say that he insists that these editors understand their markets. And once you understand your market, you don't go and pander to left-wing causes if you're a centre-right newspaper. I was an editor of various publications over quite a long period, and in that time only once did Rupert ever tell me what to write in an editorial, and that was the day that Kerr sacked Whitlam. As I was about to go home at 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Rupert came into my office and said, "Tomorrow let's have an editorial. More in sorrow than in anger, Whitlam must go."
Every politician, I don't care what country, where they are, who they are, they're all paranoid about the press.
The perception of the Murdoch papers and TV stations as kingmakers has fixated Australian Prime Ministers.
There was a determined insurgency, backed by powerful voices in the media.
So the power of News Limited needs to be brought radically under the microscope for the future health of our democracy. That's why I call for a Royal Commission into the future of Australian media ownership.
Well, hang on, Kevin. If a Prime Minister has been booted out because your colleagues don't think you've done a good enough job, who do you blame? Rupert. They all do it.
This paper is tied to no party, to no state. Its guide is faith in Australia and the country's future.
The great monolith who orders right-wing politics from around the world. Not true. He's backed one side and the other. He's and you know why? Because he has genuinely felt at the time, and I can say this from my discussions with him at the time, who is capable of doing the best job for the country.
Certainly, I love to talk to the editors about things, and they don't always follow what I say, but you know.
Really? If you said...
But I basically choose the editors, I'll admit.
Former Guardian editor-in-chief Alan Rusbridger thinks the influence happens more by osmosis.
You know, this little me act, I have no impact, is not credible. You know, he desperately wants to have impact and to influence elections and influence politicians. I don't think Rupert Murdoch's unsubtle enough to say, by the way, my price for my support is the following. So I don't think that's how it works.
In the United States with Fox News, there was a gap in the market. There was no news channel servicing a more conservative way of thinking.
Tom Mockridge now competes against his former boss. Having worked for Rupert Murdoch in 5 different countries, he says he never sensed any political imperative.
So it's been more about a business direction, putting more choice into the market, employing more journalists, investing in more news and information. It's a positive thing for diversity.
I don't think Murdoch really cares about media plurality. To him, it's a business. If he could have a monopoly, he'd be perfectly happy with that.
But despite recent success, the past decade has cast a shadow over Mr. Murdoch's legacy.
These actions do not live up to the standards that our company aspires to.
The company admitted that they'd been involved in criminal wrongdoing and no one was fired. Why was that?
Murder victims, terrorist victims who've had their phones hacked is quite disgraceful.
You're not responsible. Who is responsible?
The people that I trusted.
Revelations that Murdoch's British newspapers had been hacking the phones of celebrities and the royal family damaged not only his reputation, but that of his son James as well.
This is the most humble day of my life.
Okay, thank you. It was a very, very difficult time, and it will forever sully his record, no matter what is said about him in years to come.
There were only 2 possibilities. One was that this was a criminal cover-up, or this was an organisation that had grown so large that it was barely in control.
News International descended from the gutter to the sewers.
The News of the World closed. A former editor went to jail, but other top lieutenants were cleared.
His response in the end is to put the 2 people back in charge of it who were running it at the time. And I think a lot of people felt that was like a kind of 2 fingers, you know, to do what you like. I make my rules, this is my company.
Rupert Murdoch is now 87 years old. His eldest son, Lachlan, reportedly more politically conservative than his father, is taking the helm.
Lachlan's been operating under the radar a bit. Lachlan's been calling the shots a lot more than Rupert in recent years, particularly in the Australian market. And, you know, it's a kind of knee-jerk reaction to blame Rupert, but in fact, Lachlan's running the show these days, at least here.
Rupert Murdoch is cashing in. He offloaded Sky TV in Europe for $15 billion in September. Even bigger still, Disney is buying 21st Century Fox for $71 billion. But Fox News stays in Murdoch hands.
I'm not embarrassed by what they do at all. You have to understand that Fox News is the only mass media company in America, in this country, with conservative opinion, with strong conservative opinion in prime time. It's the only one, right? It's not one of a few, it's the only one. And I frankly feel in this country, we all have to be more tolerant of each other's views.
Mark Day believes the Disney deal was probably Rupert's last big move.
I think it's Rupert's final big decision, but that doesn't mean to say that the new Fox or News Corporation won't do other big things in the future. I think it's more likely to fall to Lachlan.
Today is the News Corp AGM, and investors will hear a message from the boss claiming it's been the most successful year since the phone hacking saga.
Well, what's the future for the companies? Business as usual. I don't know if it'll fall to Lachlan to close the presses. Probably will, but it's something that Rupert's unlikely to do.
I always thought News Corporation was going to be like all news companies. They're going to be flailing around for different kinds of revenue. But, you know, he starts with a very, very large company over which he has virtually total control, so he can push the money around that company wherever he wants.
Well, listen, let's not think legacy, because as far as I'm aware, Rupert's out there and still going very strongly. I'd keep watching.
Okay, so plenty to think about there, and of course once you've done your own research as well, you'll be able to find more information, and obviously that a lot of this is based on your own opinions of Murdoch and his empire. Of course, one of the biggest struggles Murdoch's had in recent years was, of course, the fallout from the discovery of phone hacking within the organisation. And it wasn't, you know, it's important to note at this point that it wasn't just Rupert Murdoch's newspapers that were guilty of this, but they were at front and centre of the investigations, and of course resulted in the News of the World closing down. However, rather than you listen to me sit here and talk about the history of this scandal and everything that happened, you're much better off watching an excellent documentary from the BBC, a panorama documentary called Hacking, Power, Corruption and Lies. So the documentary is about an hour long. It's well worth a watch to get an understanding of this. Whilst you are watching it, these are some notes you should make, really, or have a think about these questions. What does this tell us about newspaper ownership? Is the phone hacking scandal a result of corruption within the company, or would you say it's a result of corruption within the entire newspaper industry? And do you feel that this expands the debate that we talked about when we were discussing regulation with the Daily Mirror, about protecting citizens versus protecting press freedom and freedom of speech? And the last one's a bit trickier to answer, really, but again, it's more opinion-based. Do you feel that despite the massive corruption throughout, do you feel the audience shares any responsibility regarding why phone hacking was happening? Obviously, I'm not suggesting that the audience engaged in their own phone hacking, but do you feel that the desire for more and more salacious stories was in some way and in some part we can blame the audience for this? So some really interesting moral questions to think about there, and certainly ones that are opinion based. But watch the documentary, enjoy, make plenty of notes throughout, and this will give you a good understanding of the history of what has happened in the past 10 to 20 years. So moving on, let's get some background and context and plenty of things for you to get some notes on as we move along. As you probably know, the Times was first published in 1785 and is part of the Times newspaper group, which is a subsidiary of News UK. The News UK are a British-based yet American-owned newspaper publisher, and they are a subsidiary of the American mass media conglomerate News Corp. Now, News Corp is actually a newly formed company which concentrates on newspapers and publishing. The company formed following a split from News Corporation, a powerful conglomerate with interests in film and broadcasting and newspapers and publishing. The company, as we've said before, also produces the Sun newspaper and previously the News of the World, which ceased publication following the phone hacking scandal of 2011, but has kind of re-emerged as the Sunday Sun. Now, the company has demonstrated a predominantly right-wing political allegiance with the Sun newspaper backing the Conservative government in recent elections. However, the Times has maintained a more neutral stance. That's what I'd like you to think. So, to what extent is this true? What I'd like you to do is to try and find evidence in print and online of the newspaper's political ideology. So do you feel it is neutral, or do you feel it does side with one particular party? Particularly, does it have a sort of conservative leaning as its sister publication, The Sun, does? Just a word before you do that. The Times is behind a paywall, so you will need a login to be able to look at articles in full, which is preferable, but you may get a sense from the sort of limited amount of articles you can read from a non-subscribed position. Now, the group, as I've said, was one of the first companies actually in the UK to introduce an online newspaper, but also a paywall, which, as we've said, requires readers to pay for the use of the site. And that was introduced in response to the fall in print sales within that group. However, the Times is currently the only national quality newspaper to show year-on-year growth for print sales, with over 400,000 on a daily average. Now, what I'd like you to think about is how else are the Times embracing online technologies, and particularly with social media. What presence does it have online? How does it reach different audiences, so multiple audiences? And how do they combat competition from other newspapers that aren't behind the paywall? Because some would say that perhaps being behind the paywall puts people off and are more likely to go to free newspapers. So how would you say they combat competition from other newspapers that don't sit behind a paywall? Okay, moving on to some of the important stuff as we prepare for the exam. In particular, the theoretical framework, and we'll start with Curran and Seaton, which of course have these ideas about ownership within the media. One thing that's always impossible to argue with is certainly demonstrable fact that the media is controlled by a number of companies that are driven by a logic of profit and power. We've looked at videos in the past that said that 90% of the media output across the world is owned by 5 or 6 companies. Certainly that proves the suggestion that there is only a small number of companies. The next 2 points made are the ones that we have to try and kind of prove or disprove, or see whether or not our case studies reinforce. Their suggestion is that this media concentration certainly limits variety, creativity and quality, so that the bigger companies tend to put out a homogeneous, safe output. The sort of concluding thoughts are that if there were more socially diverse patterns of ownership, this actually helps to create the conditions where you can have more variety, more adventurous output, maybe greater diversity within content as well. So what do we think about the Times? Does the way that the Times operate actually prove or disprove Curran and Seaton's ideas, and what would you use as your evidence? Well, what we could say, and you may have found this, is that seeing as the Times is part of actually both a horizontally and a vertically integrated company, and subsequently it's part of a large conglomerate, being part of a huge press organisation could actually limit or inhibit creativity and journalist press freedom. And of course, this, when we look at it, comes down to the fact that that is owned by one man. Rupert Murdoch is often accused of controlling his newspaper content and his editorial teams, which would of course support this point that the despite the fact that it's part of a huge organisation, the buck stops with just one man. However, we could argue the other point, I suppose. It's by having a more diverse pattern of ownership with, all these different organisations melded together, this could offer a diverse more pattern of ownership and could suggest a more pluralistic approach, could create the conditions for more varied and adventurous media productions. So we have to look at the reality and maybe do a little bit of research here. So, take this time now to just research the way that the paper operates and to prove whether or not the buck really does just stop with Rupert Murdoch, whether or not actually the ownership of the newspaper by one man really does limit and inhibit a variety of representations or ideologies. Well, one argument is that suggests that the Times seems to really lack a variety and diversity in its ideological messages. It's consistently been anti-Europe and pro-Brexit, and this might be to do the traditional approach the Times has to issues, or due to the longevity of Murdoch's conglomerate ownership. There is a lack of diversity and creativity that could be the result of the majority of journalists being predominantly middle class, white males, reinforcing hegemonic ideas. Of course, the people involved in the Times and its parent companies really do seem to be driven by power. Watching that documentary, you may have realised that or noticed that how Rebecca Brooks, or former editor of the News of the World, Rebecca Brooks, her relationship with David Cameron, Rupert Murdoch's meetings with presidents and prime ministers over the number of years now, and their desire to influence election results and, of course, referenda. If you're in any doubt of this, there's quite an interesting selection of quotations about Rupert Murdoch or from Rupert Murdoch and his proprietorial influence. First one here from David Yelland, former editor of The Sun. "You see the world through Rupert's eyes." Quite clearly a statement to suggest that his influence within the newspapers is there on the pages. Rupert Murdoch himself, this one particular quotation, "For better or worse, our company is a reflection of my thinking, my character and my values." So if there's any doubt really of the limitations of a single person owning such a big organisation, it's there in white on black, I suppose. The other huge debate really that's come up recently away from ownership and ethics of the media is the future of newspaper, because like many other print publications, newspapers could be considered to be in real trouble, and as we saw from our previous study of the industry when we looked at the Daily Mirror, print sales are rapidly in decline, even if the Times is maybe going up or bucking a trend. But I'd like you to watch a couple of videos and just make some notes on the future of news media. Really thinking about the arguments that are made, which bits do you agree with, and which bits are less convincing, and can we relate any of these ideas to what you've looked at with the Times and how it's trying to ensure its continued longevity? Can we relate any of these ideas to the Daily Mirror and perhaps its decline? And think about David Hesmagulch, who we've studied a number of times on the course so far. Can we relate any of his ideas here? So, as I said, a couple of videos, about the potential future of newspapers and journalism as a whole, and the area in which journalism is moving.
It's not the internet that's killing the newspaper, it's that newspapers are trying too hard to hold on to a past. The problem here is that there are new opportunities newspapers have not seen. What they're seeing instead is fear of change. Every other industry in this country and this world has to change because of the internet. Why shouldn't newspapers? Other industries that are smart are embracing this change, and newspapers are out of fear only beginning to. It doesn't make any difference to me whether or not the printing press continues, as long as the journalism continues. I met Alan Rusbridger, the editor of The Guardian, long ago, and they had just spent $150 million on new presses. And he said very calmly, oh yes, those are probably the last presses we'll ever buy. Now, I can imagine an American publisher would say that and keel over at that moment. But Rusbridger realizes that what he's continuing is the journalism. And he's got to find ways to make it continue in this new world. It's not going to be the same as it was. Newspapers were one-size-fits-all monopolies. Those days are over. The business has changed. The scale of the business has changed. But if they start thinking more collaboratively, if they start thinking more flexibly, I think journalism can actually grow. If I were running the New York Times company today, I would use the Boston Globe as a laboratory to do all kinds of new and brave things and figure out what to do. Maybe it shouldn't be in print. Maybe it should go hyper-local. Maybe it should go multimedia. Maybe it should be 5 different products. I don't know, but I would try them out in Boston. At the New York Times itself, their strength is their weakness because they are this incredible institution and they're trying to protect that, and for good reason. But that protectionism is not a strategy for the future. And then they realize that. I'm not saying anything to them they don't know. They are trying to do new things, but they're constantly saddled with being the New York Times. So what I hope really happens is that in newspapers across the country, we'll see experiments about new ways to do things. The Madison Capital Times, an afternoon paper in a 2-paper market, has just gone out of print, except for 2 once-a-week supplements, and they're now going to go solely online. We'll see how that works. I think every paper in the country should be looking at new experiments and seeing new ways to do things.
And this second video is really more to do with journalism and the changes in attitudes towards journalism and a direction in which journalism might go.
Hi. So in 2005, I was working at my dream job. I was a local TV news producer at a media market station in New England. And I had worked so hard for this job, and I loved it so much that I was willing to wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning every day to go to work. I would interview local politicians, community leaders, business owners about important issues like, what do you think of property taxes? How is the new highway going to impact your business? So one day my boss comes to me and says, Ricky, go get this story. Heated car seats can be dangerous. I am very sure she wanted me to come back with a story that looked like this. There is a philosophy in news. If it bleeds, it leads. We wanted to grab eyeballs because the more eyeballs we have, the more expensive advertising we can sell. I spent the next couple of days calling ambulance chaser attorneys asking about exploding car seats. All of them told me that I was reaching a little too hard for a story that wasn't there. And still, my boss wanted to grab attention and wallets. She wasn't particularly concerned with giving people news that could help them. I believe the news should help us. I also believe that the news used to do a lot better job of giving us information that helped us, rather than just trying to make money. And I believe that this is a big reason why we no longer trust the news media. They don't seem to really want to help us. They want to hold our attention to sell ads. The good news is that I think that we can fix this. In a broader sense, I think that we can fix the news and restore the implied contract that it has with the public. A contract is just an agreement between parties, in this case, the public and the news media. Today, I no longer do stories about exploding car seats. I do pledge breaks. I work for an Atlanta NPR affiliate as an on-air broadcaster, and I hope that when I turn on the microphone every afternoon, people trust me because they know that I'm trying to give them stories that add to their lives. Trust is a contract. It's an unspoken agreement that a person or an organization will respect your best interests. We had an unspoken agreement with the news media. It is pretty clear that that contract of trust is broken. Look at these numbers. Less than a quarter of Americans say that they trust the news. Apply that to this room, everybody from this aisle over would think that the news media was full of it. Now, not trusting the news media may not seem like a big deal in your day-to-day life, but think about all of the decisions that you make every day based on information that you consider trustworthy. You pick out clothes to wear in the morning based on the weather report. That is trust. You decide to buy a food item at the grocery store based on the information on the package. That is trust. When it comes to the news media, that contract of trust helps us decide how we're going to vote, how we want our tax dollars spent, whether or not our family members and friends in the military and thousands of other Americans should go to war. So when we make any decision based on outside information, we need to be able to trust it. We saw an example of this with Hurricanes Harvey and Maria and Irma. In the days leading up to the storms, millions of people needed accurate information that they considered trustworthy so that they could prepare to keep themselves and their loved ones safe. And still, false news was circulating. One email claimed that rainfall and flooding amounts were wrong. Another widely shared Facebook post claimed that the news media was downplaying the size of the storms. With lives at stake, with our finances at stake, arguably with our democracy at stake, why do so few people trust the news? I believe it's because this balance has subtly shifted. The news media doesn't seem to really want to help us. They seem more interested in keeping our attention to sell ads. The economics of this mean that the news media can't really rely anymore on advertisements and revenue and subscriptions. Many outlets are now largely paid with your attention. It's actually called the attention economy. We all know what this looks like. We have all heard of clickbait. We've all clicked on clickbait. These 20 animals' net worth will make you gasp for breath. It's ridiculous. And it works. You click on this, and the sponsor makes money. I clicked on it. Mainstream TV news is not immune from this type of luring of eyeballs. In August 2014, during a news broadcast, the anchors at Fox 5 WNYW New York were cheering as the meteorologist comes out and proceeds to take off his shirt and flex his well-toned muscles. I clicked on that video. But simply giving you information so that you can understand the world better no longer keeps the news media in business. We can fix this. We can restore our contract of trust in the news. It's as simple as supply and demand. We can demand that the news media help us. So how can we do this? I have 5 ideas for you today. Number 1, distinguish between news and journalism. Seek out information sources that take more time to explain things to you. Because when it comes to understanding the world, shorter is not sweeter. In 2012, 80% of local TV news stories were less than a minute. How can you understand anything in 55 seconds? Journalism takes time to explain the whole story with multiple perspectives. News is just new information. When we demand more informative stories, we encourage the news media to supply us with longer, deeper storytelling. Number 2, opt for fact over opinion. Talking heads now dominate homepages and newscasts. As of 5 years ago, Commentary and opinion had crept up to 63% of national cable news. Opinionators understand the issues well enough for them to tell you what they think. How can you honestly know what you think without the facts, the context, the reporting? When we demand information over opinion, we push the news media to supply us with journalism over talking heads. Number 3, yes, get out of your echo chamber. Be aware of what people you disagree with are saying, and be genuinely curious why. On social media, go ahead and follow thought leaders, politicians, activists with whom you disagree, and click on their posts. When we demand to understand opposing viewpoints, we motivate the news media to supply us with balanced, objective reporting. Number 4, go global. Consider frequenting international news sources. You will very quickly see that people elsewhere in the world see things so differently than we do here at home. Now, ideas from far away may seem irrelevant, but they give you a very good idea of where we stand in a global conversation. When we demand international perspectives, we embolden the news media to supply us with a broader scope of ideas and perspectives. And number 5, and certainly the simplest, yep, go out and buy one of these. When was the last time any of us paid for our news? Most of us don't. But if we want the news media to supply us with information that helps us, we have got to free them from having to hold our attention with scandal and sensationalism and downright silly stories. We have got to break the news out of the attention economy. 9 out of 10 adults say that they get their news online. Subscribe to an online journalism website, donate to a nonprofit television station, or go out and buy a newspaper. And here's a great way to pay it forward. Consider giving subscriptions to family and friends for holiday and birthday presents, or donate to your child's school. This is our modern-day example of the power of the purse. When we pay for our news, we are demanding that the news media supply us with journalism over clickbait, analysis over pop-up ads. Now, the news media's got to do their part too, and that means addressing the elephant in the room and the donkey, which is that the news media is politically and socially polarizing right now. I was recently giving a speech about the state of the news media to a group of Roman Catholic priests in Charleston, South Carolina. I was wrapping up my remarks and taking questions, and a man in the back raised his hand and he said, "I was just wondering how many conservatives work in your newsroom?" I told him I don't know the political leanings of my colleagues, but I understood his point. He is among millions of Americans, and many of you may be among them, who don't feel that they're seeing conservative viewpoints adequately represented in the news media. The people who work in the news media meant for all Americans need to reflect all Americans. News executives talk all day long about adding diversity among staff and contributors in terms of things like race and gender and sexual identity. All of that is incredibly vital. How well are newsrooms doing prioritizing diversity of political thought? When you see your political ideas reflected in the news media, you are more likely to trust the news media. So, it's so easy to be angry, even really frustrated. There's other words for it about the news media right now. This isn't the worst it's ever been. Who here has heard of Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds? The worst it has ever been may possibly have been October 30th, 1938. Aliens landed on Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and dispatched to take over the world. Mass hysteria ensued. People thronged police stations demanding to be evacuated. Those who couldn't handle the shock dropped dead of a heart attack. Others tried suicide. At least that's what the Post and the Times and other newspapers reported. The truth is that the great American storyteller, Orson Welles, had simply aired a very frightening radio drama. After all, it was almost Halloween. Some people expressed concern, sure, but most understood the disclaimers during War of the Worlds that it was fictional entertainment. And still, the newspapers kept churning out these stories, very likely in an effort to discredit their new rival in the news business, the very new technology of radio. We also live in an era of unprecedented technological upheaval that's transforming the ways in which we communicate. Of course, we're confused about who to trust. What has not changed is the power of the free market. Consumers have incredible influence over the news media. Supply always follows demand. We are the demand. And just like those listeners in 1938 who knew that War of the Worlds was just a good bit of Halloween fun, we are so much smarter than the news media gives us credit for. Let's harness the tried and true forces of the free market to demand that the news media stop reducing the very serious and very complex issues of our day to mindless clickbait, shallow headlines, and partisan sensationalism. We deserve news that helps us make better sense of the world around us. Let's restore our contract of trust in the news media by helping the news media help us. Let's restore our trust in the news. Thank you.
Okay, so well, some really interesting points made there. But let's sort of try and round up some of your thoughts and ideas on this to sort of get a feel for what you think on these ideas. And these are all questions you should be able to answer for yourself based on the research and the videos that we've been watching. What are your opinions regarding the future of newspapers? Has social media killed the traditional ways in which we consume news, and how and why? And what would be your evidence for that? Are we constructing our own agendas based on who we follow on social media, what we like, what we decide to retweet or post? Are we the new agenda setters for ourselves, or are we influenced by other people? And is this dangerous or problematic in any way? In what ways could we say potentially this the change to news media is dangerous, or would you say it's liberating? Is this a good thing? And of course, I mentioned it earlier on, but this does all relate to the ideas of David Hesmagulch and his work on cultural industries. So his points are that the cultural industry companies or media companies try to minimise their risk and maximise their audiences through vertical and horizontal integration and by formatting their cultural products. And that can be done in a number of different ways. For example, in films they use stars or franchises. He also says that the largest companies and conglomerates now actually operate across a wide range of different media industries. And thirdly, he says that the radical potential of the internet has actually been contained to some extent by its partial incorporation into large profit-orientated sets of cultural industries rather than being allowed to kind of run free by itself. My question is, does the way that the Times operate prove or disprove Hesmagulch's ideas? What evidence would you use? And a hint here clearly is to use the website and the Times' online presence to try and prove or disprove his points? Well, the first one's fairly simple, isn't it? The Times newspaper group is part of both a horizontal and a vertically integrated company, and of course it has a wide range of titles, and it does all of these things in order to maximise its audiences and to minimise its risk, to spread its blanket as far and wide as possible when capturing audiences and making money. And to combine that with another point, rather than seeing digital media as a threat, the company has embraced its digital expansion and introduced paywalls to allow for online content to be viewed while still generating more and more income. And as part of News Corp, the company finds itself as part of a wide organisation responsible for different cultural industries. They don't just make newspapers but publish magazines, also involved in TV, and so on and so forth. Of course, this can benefit the newspaper greatly in terms of production and promotion and advertising tie-ins and so forth. So let's move away from Hesmagulch and onto regulation. So to begin this, there's an article I'd like you to read all about the findings of the Leveson Inquiry. We referenced it in the lesson to do with the Daily Mirror. You've obviously seen a lot more with the documentary about corruption in the newspaper industry. There's a short article about the findings of the Leveson Inquiry. And following that inquiry, much of the debate surrounded the relative merit of state-run regulation versus self-regulation. So just read the article and then in your own time and your own ideas, what would you say are the pros and cons of state regulation versus self-regulated press industry? Of course, this debate took many forms and guises, and I just want to show you just one section of the debate with that kind of interesting argument between privacy laws and versus freedom of expression or freedom of speech, when it kind of enters into kind of quite interesting and difficult moral territory. This is a debate between Ian Hislop, who is the editor of a magazine called Private Eye, standing up for freedom of expression and freedom of press, versus the mother of a victim of press intrusion on a Channel 4 debate. So basically watch the debate and decide which parts of it you agree and disagree with. And, to be honest, you might agree or disagree with arguments from both sides, and that's absolutely fine.
Baroness Hollins, your daughter was paralysed by a knife attack, and in the aftermath of that appalling tragedy, how were you treated by the press?
Well, there was extraordinary press interest, media interest in her, in what had happened to her, and actually in her bravery in surviving and just her courage. But the intrusion by the press was extraordinarily difficult to cope with, including press doorstepping, telephoto lenses, all manner of intrusion, not just for kind of the family immediately around her, but including for her grandmother, for example, who was living 200 miles away and was terminally ill with cancer. And we had at one point to call police to ask them to remove a journalist who was refusing to go without photographs of my daughter. This went on for a very long time, a really long time. And on anniversaries of her injury, for example, we would also begin to see journalists queuing up outside to come and find out how she was. And even 5 years afterwards, when she had another baby, we had journalists camping outside and putting our house and her house under surveillance so that they could follow her. And do you know what was perhaps the most difficult was that the stories that were printed in the press, although they were kindly enough, were not true, most of them. And it only took 2 words from one neighbour or one person for a whole lot of information to be taken off the internet and regurgitated as if it was new, which in my world we'd call plagiarism.
And all of this must have compounded what was an incredibly traumatic time for the whole family.
Yes, I gave evidence to the Leveson Inquiry about it, and indeed it was. It was extraordinarily traumatic, and not what you need when you're dealing with another kind of trauma. And you actually need privacy at that time to be able to pull together as a family and to cope with the real life circumstance that you're facing.
Well, Ian, when you hear that account, it's hard to see, isn't it, how the press can be trusted by people like Baroness Hollins to put their own house in order.
Well, I didn't come on the programme to answer Baroness Hollins or to give any evidence about that case, about which I know nothing. I'm here to talk about the principle of the freedom of the press and the necessity of, or not, of state regulation, which I'm against, along with a lot of other people, including Index on Censorship and a lot of respected bodies who are interested in protecting our freedoms. It's not a popular position at the moment, and a lot of the press have not helped themselves historically. But that doesn't alter the fact, it doesn't alter the evidence I gave to Leveson, which is that I do not think we need state regulation of the press, which is dangerous. Okay. Internationally, it has a very, very bad record, and it's very difficult for Britain, I think, to argue that we need it here.
But can victims of press intrusion trust the press to get their own house in order?
Well, again, I didn't come on here to talk about victims of press intrusion. My point to Leveson was all the way through, the law needs to be enforced. And we have laws in this country about harassment and about libel, and we have a lot of laws in this country, and we don't need any more from politicians. So, I mean, it's a fairly simple position. That is where I stand.
Baroness Hollins, could you have used existing laws to tackle the intrusion that you faced? I mean, you talked about calling the police, for example. How were not existing laws adequate?
Look, the last thing you want is to have to start using the law and finding out what the law is when you're in the middle of a family situation like I described. So, do you know, freedom of the press is something I absolutely agree with. What is being proposed by the cross-party charter is not state regulation. It's not at all, and I think it's a parody of it to even suggest that it's state regulation. It is not. The idea is that the press have been supposedly self-regulating themselves for years, and in the last 70 years, I think there have been seven inquiries into the ethics and behaviour of the press. This time, I think it's time to act, and the idea is not to interfere with freedom, but to expect the press to behave responsibly. And any regulator which is set up, and indeed the press are free to propose a regulator, but it must be Leveson compliant. And the only thing which is in place.
Well, again, I mean, I don't want to disagree with, you know, the mother of a victim. I mean, no one wants to look worse on this than necessary, but Leveson compliant doesn't necessarily mean anything. There are huge sections of Leveson that don't make any sense. Some of them are nonsense. Some of them have been dropped already. There is no simple answer to this, and it is no good saying that people who are arguing that the press must be free haven't got the point, don't understand, or are indulging in a parody, or that we are callous and unsympathetic to the victims. Nor is it fair to say, particularly in people in my own case, that we're not aware of the bad behaviour of the press. My magazine has spent about 40 years running examples of the way in which the press misbehave. And this week we have a new set of rather furious people who are complaining about the behaviour of the press. I mean, the press is not pretty, but it is free. And it is no good saying we have got in place systems that will ensure that regulation doesn't make the press not free. It is unintended consequences. And if you look at all the precedents for state regulation, they are very bad. Everyone starts out with just a little bit of regulation, just a dab, just a hint of it here and there, and it ends up with politicians deciding what goes into the press. And that is a principle which I and a very large number of other people, this isn't an unpopular view, think is dangerous.
So, obviously bringing the debate sort of forward, and it's, you know, highly and emotionally charged ideas, and whilst you can be very sympathetic towards someone whose life has been intruded by the press, the points that Ian Hislop make are really interesting, to suggest that actually there are actual laws in place that stop that kind of harassment and ideas, and that his concern would be any kind of state regulation, which is something we've discussed in previous sessions as well. Obviously, the PCC, Press Complaints Commission, was found to be completely not fit for purpose in the run-up to the phone hacking scandal, and after the Leveson Inquiry came out, the resulting change to regulation was IPSO. And so here's a quick little video just to show you how IPSO, the current press regulator, works. Okay, so that's the promotional video, if you like, on IPSO, or how it's supposed to work. Very, very simple question. Is it a suitable response to Leveson's findings? Do you agree with that's the right way to go or not? And give your reasons. Now, following the inquiry, an organisation was formed by many of the victims of phone hacking scandal, and most of these were normal people who feels that their lives were intruded, and inevitably there are certain celebrities as well that gave the campaign somewhat of a higher profile. Two of the highest profile of these, I suppose, were British actors Steve Coogan and Hugh Grant, who were often used as the face of the campaign and whose mission statement was to hold the press to account after the Leveson Inquiry. So this organisation was called Hacked Off. Again, there's another article just to read from their website. And then after you've read the article, watch this, I suppose, somewhat heated backwards and forwards on the BBC between Steve Coogan.
You still don't like this new press regulator. It's a year in. Why not?
Ipso is a sham. It was set up by newspaper proprietors and editors under the guise of a rather secretive organisation called the Regulatory Funding Company, who basically are vested interests of the press. So they're acting really as judge, jury and executioner. So really it's not an effective independent regulatory body at all. And the public opinion reflects this in all the polls that have been done. 78% or upwards of that regard the Leveson Inquiry as important. And not only that, but any regulatory body has to be Leveson compliant. And Ipso isn't that, and actually makes a point of claiming not to be.
In the last year, I think it's looked at something like 200 complaints, and it's upheld 48 of them. I mean, it is dealing with complaints and ordering corrections and retractions, isn't it?
No, I don't think it is. It's doing as much as it needs to do to appear to be compliant. There really is. Most people who have been polled regard it as not effective. It actually, most people agree that the PCC that ran before was completely ineffective. It failed to spot the hacking scandal at all, and actually the new body is more or less the PCC Mark II. It's housed in the same offices, populated by the same staff.
Okay.
It really is the same old story.
Okay, let me introduce Steve Coogan, if you don't mind.
The people who are behind it, the people who fund it, are people who have no interest in effective press regulation. Their only interest really are protecting their commercial interests, increasing their profit margins, and any appearance for it to be an effective press regulator are just specious, because, as I say before, they've made a point, and they're rather proud of it not being Leveson compliant.
Okay, Steve Coogan, I have sitting next to me here in the studio the chief executive of Ipso. He's called Matt T. He's been listening to you. He's literally just joined us here. Mr. T, what do you say to Steve Coogan? Talk to him directly when he says you represent a sham organisation.
I don't represent a sham organisation. I represent an organisation that's doing a very valuable job for the public in investigating complaints and in stopping harassment by publications where that happens.
But you're just the same, this is the criticism, as the old Press Complaints Commission.
I'd say basically the people on my side of the argument don't have any paymasters the way he does. His wages are being paid by the same organisation that is trying to protect their vested interests.
Okay, well, let him respond to that.
Anyone. I'm saying this because I believe it. No one's paying my wages. No one pays the wages of people in Hacked Off. We're independent people who have a very, very sincere belief in this. And we don't have a big organisation. We don't have deep pockets.
Okay, well, let Matt T respond to you, Steve Coogan. Matt T, respond to Steve Coogan.
So we are funded by the press. But that's actually
that's the key point, isn't it?
It isn't the key point. What Leveson said was,
how can you possibly be independent then?
What Leveson said was that there should be independent self-regulation of the press. The only thing you can do is either have a regulator which is funded by the industry that it regulates. That's a very common arrangement, or you have a regulator that's funded by the public purse. And we believe that it would be wrong to be funded by the public purse. That really would call into question our independence. The regulator is headed up by my chairman, who is a former appeal court judge. I'm a former Whitehall Civil Service Permanent Secretary. We are very independent people. We behave very independently.
Isn't perception everything? The fact that you are funded by newspapers means that people can't trust you.
Victoria, I would say you have only two options. I don't think people would trust us if we were funded by the state, by the taxpayer. What I would say is that we should be seen on the job we do, and we are handling complaints for people, and we are dealing with harassment where it happens.
Steve Coogan, they are dealing with harassment when it happens.
The other thing to point out actually at this point is that the people in Ipso who claim to want to, who complain about Impress and complain about us at Hacked Off because they see themselves as or Leveson compliance as being in some way threatening to the press, are the same people who are quite happy to operate under a system which completely lacks plurality.
Okay, but just deal with the point that Matt T has made. The point that Matt T has made is that they are dealing with complaints of harassment.
It's all good. It's saying we are saying we are independent, right? Doesn't cut it. You can say we're independent as much as you like.
No, he's saying they are dealing with complaints of harassment.
And it's clearly not transparent because the paymasters are the very people who own the newspapers. It's judge, jury and executioner. The same people who control the press shouldn't be policing themselves. That's blindingly obvious.
They're not policing themselves. We have a board and a complaints committee which are made up by a majority of people with no background in the press at all. So it isn't the press overseeing themselves, it's being overseen by independent regulation.
What's the problem with Leveson compliance? Tell me your problem with that.
The problem with Leveson...
with being Leveson compliant.
What Hacked Off would like us to do is seek recognition under the Royal Charter. The newspapers that we regulate, and indeed the ones we don't, have made clear that they will not join a regulator that is recognised under the Royal Charter. Alan Rusbridger of The Guardian, no right-wing media baron, described the Royal Charter as being effectively controlled by ministers. Now,
Okay, let me go back to Steve Coogan then. What is the big deal about the Royal Charter? Just explain that to our audience. Why would that satisfy you, Mr. Coogan?
The Royal Charter was actually a sap to the press to try and reach a compromise.
So what is
we didn't particularly want a Royal
Okay.
Charter in the first place.
Right.
That was an acquiescence to the press to try and reach an agreement. So for them to turn around later and then criticise it is total hypocrisy.
So what do you
that was
want
part
now?
of the original negotiation.
What do you want now? Do you want taxpayers to fund this organisation?
In Impress, who can't fully explain why they don't want to be Leveson compliant. And I'll tell you the real reason is because they're worried that it will affect their profit margins and their profitability.
Okay.
And claims to have an effective regulator is an absolute sham. Most people agree with this. The public
you've made that
polls
point.
show
I'm going
that
to give
people want
Matt
a
T
Leveson
final 20 seconds. This is about protecting newspapers' profit margins.
It's contempt for their
utter
readership.
rubbish. What it's about is about protecting the public.
families,
It's
the Hillsborough
about
victims,
having a
contempt for
regulator
the
that
Dowlers,
covers the
contempt for all
vast
the genuine
majority of
victims of
newspapers
press
and
abuse.
magazines
If you
in this
both
country.
talk at the same time, we can't hear either of you.
It's about having a regulator that covers the vast majority of newspapers and magazines in this country where there is an effective process for people to seek redress if they feel that they've been illed by the press. And that's what we are.
So, as I said, fairly heated backwards and forwards there, particularly as they end up shouting over each other. However, some important points made, and more importantly, does this confirm what you thought, or does it change your mind about press regulation? So let's bring in the theoretical framework here, and of course, as we've said before, when we're considering the theoretical framework in relation to newspapers and regulation, there are two main debates that need to be considered. First one is that old argument between the freedom of speech as a right and the need for press regulation. The second one is how do various technological and cultural contexts, how have they changed the way we look at regulation? So a few questions just to answer. How can we relate everything that we've discussed so far to the issues raised by Livingston and Lunt? In other words, everything we've discussed regarding new technologies, how the press is using online media to reach audiences, but also the ethics of their practices. And finally, can you find relevant stories or ideas that might be discussed as examples from the Times' website? In other words, can you find any stories from the Times' website that might be considered something that does tip over the edge of press intrusion or exploitation? Or would you say that the Times is a newspaper that is compliant with the ideas that the Leveson Inquiry brought up? And after what is quite a mammoth session, and that's everything. And there's plenty more you can find out about Hacked Off and their crusade, if you like, and to keep that debate going. And of course, keep yourself well abreast of everything that the Times and the Daily Mirror are doing online to further their own ideologies, but also to stave off the decline of newspapers and try and stay relevant in a world that is turning its back on newspapers in many ways and looking to social media and other online media to get its daily news.